Welcome to this session of History 2. This is the session discussing Jimi Hendrix, Pink Floyd, and The Who, as well as the Monterey Pop Festival. So this is the first of two sessions that will discuss at least part of the session in this case, and then most of the session for next session, the big rock festivals at the end of the 60s and beginning of the 70s, and how for a brief moment there was this kind of idealization of the political, social, cultural possibility of the rock festival. It meant much more than just having a bunch of bands perform to a bunch of people, and because it meant so much more, it was an even greater letdown when it all collapsed. So today we're talking about some of the bands that made that possible, that made these large events possible, or acts, Jimi Hendrix, Pink Floyd, and The Who. And then next time we'll take a look at the biggest of all of the rock festivals, at least within the cultural imagination, which is of course Woodstock, and then we'll talk about the decline of the form. Hendrix, Pink Floyd, and The Who, obviously some of the most influential and most revered acts of the end of the 60s, and then throughout the 70s for at least Pink Floyd and The Who. Of course, Hendrix didn't live long enough to have a career throughout that decade. The Who, the classic lineup, was formed in 1964, and that's, of course, Roger Daltrey on vocals, Pete Townsend, guitar, John Entwistle on bass, and Keith Moon on drums. They started out from the mod scene, a London fashion subculture with tailor-made suits, motor scooters, especially the Vespa or the Lambretta, use of amphetamines for all-night dancing. Right, the mods were in constant conflict with the rockers, who wore leather and rode motorcycles. By 1965, the conflict had largely subsided, being surpassed by the swinging London era, which we'll talk about a bit. That grew out of mod fashion. And yet, as we'll see, the Who continue to build on the sort of ethos of the mod era, and they continue to sort of mythologize, especially in albums like Quadrophenia, that struggle between the rockers and the mods. Here they are. Here's the Who, right? Daltrey all the way to the left there, Townsend right next to him, who is a very, I think, interesting guitarist in some ways. Some of the early guitar work on The Who is not always him, right? For instance, Jimmy Page substituted for him in the studio at times. I think that's part of what caused the rivalry with Jimmy Page. Townsend, who is, of course, a very opinionated person, and who cares? Why not? He has some rather disparaging things to say about Page. This is personal opinion, but I would take Page over Townsend pretty much any day. But Townsend is a very interesting guitarist in some ways. His approach to especially accompaniment can be quite interesting. Listen to a number of songs, Pinball Wizard even, right? And the precision of some of the rhythm playing on that. And then some of the ideas in the arpeggiation of Behind Blue Eyes and things like that. And of course, Keith Moon is a very interesting drummer, right? A kind of raucous drummer. In some ways, he's a counterpart to John Bonham of Led Zeppelin. With that degree of energy and the way that he approaches the set as an instrument of not just keeping a beat, but really an instrument that's participating in the group. Here's just a quick, side by side. Obviously I'm poisoning the well a little bit. I'm taking pictures that are almost stereotypical in a way, but it helps to clarify the rockers versus the mods. So the rockers with the almost throwback to the 50s style, right? The leather jackets, the jeans. There's not a motorcycle in this particular picture, but you can imagine one, and so on. The boots, right? and then that particular hairstyle. And then you have the mods on the Vespas and the Lambrettas, the scooters, wearing the helmet for the one fellow, the very neat haircut of the other fellow. They've got the zip-up jackets with the hoods and so on. So very different fashion senses, very different senses of the self. And also, in one sense, the picture would be even better if there were some women in the rockers picture, so that you could get a sense of their identity within the scene. There is a woman toward the back of the mod picture, right? In both situations, women were in a relatively subservient role within those subcultures, but they have very different roles at the same time as to how they were seen, how they were perceived, which might be worth thinking about as well. Part of what the Who are involved in is auto-destructive art, right? They created a kind of auto-destructive art by destroying their instruments on stage. And here you can see Townsend thrusting his guitar through an amplifier, right? He's and a lot of this, you can read it in all sorts of ways, right? But this became a major part of the mod and psychedelic movements in the mid to late 60s. And we'll see how Hendrix, for instance, deals with this idea of the auto-destructive. The 60s were a great period for auto-destructive art, not just in the popular music scene, but in the gallery scene, in the art world, and then in the classical music or experimental music scene as well. It was during the 60s, for instance, that Yoko Ono had a piece where she just lit a piano on fire. And then the idea was to listen to the sounds of the piano as the strings burst and as it creaked and so on, as it was consumed by the fire. So this is a piece that, of course, can never be done again, at least not live, because any other piano being burnt will make different sounds, will have different results, right? So there's an element here of chance. Just like when Pete Townsend destroys his guitar by thrusting it through an amp and therefore destroys the amp as well, and the feedback that's going to result and the sounds that are going to result, that's going to be different each time he does it, right? So there's a sense in which what you're involved in is a kind of immediacy, a kind of the momentness, that you are listening to damage being done, and each thing that falls apart, each thing that is destroyed will be destroyed in its own way. It's not duplicable. It's not something that you can do again in that exact manner, right? And it also has this element of confrontation to it. Yoko Ono burning a piano is in a sense burning a tradition, a very storied tradition that goes back to at least the end of Mozart's life and Beethoven's life, right? This where the piano is a central component, or if you wish to go even further back, you can think of the keyboard instrument as a central component to refined musical expression, and by burning it, she's also kind of burning that tradition. There are plenty of other examples of auto-destructive art, right? Where you're making things that are going to erode. The 60s is also the great era of environmental art, where you create these sculptures at the seashore, and then as the water pulls at it, it's eroding that artwork, right? Or as storms occur, they're eroding and destroying that artwork. And part of the enjoyment of it, or part of the way of thinking of it, is that it is ephemeral, that it won't last, that it will be destroyed. But this is different from that, I think. This is closer to the Yoko Ono paradigm. The idea that part of what's being destroyed here is it's being destroyed through an act of violence. And so there's a kind of Dionysian aspect to it. And we'll talk about this on and off throughout the semester, but the idea of the Apollonian versus the Dionysian. Apollo is the god of order, the god of light, the god of clarity, the god of understanding, of things being understood. Dionysus is the god of obscurity, the god of wine and drunkenness, the god of the loss of identity, the god where things aren't understood, they're faced with emotion, so the god of destruction and disorder, right? And to a certain extent, to a large extent, commentators in the 60s and early 70s saw this kind of music and saw psychedelia in general as being beholden to the Dionysian So the Dionysus is the god. This idea of immersion in the group, of emotion over rationality, of destruction over creation, or creation coming about through a kind of destruction, and that destruction focuses the energy of creation into the moment. It's something that is ephemeral. Dionysus, after all, is a god who is conjured up, right? He comes back from the dead. He's conjured up through these rituals and then disappears again, falls away again, is once again destroyed. So it's ephemeral. It's of this moment. It's something that you're conjuring. You can see how this is going to have an impact on the kind of festivals that we're going to talk about in a moment, where the entire idea is to conjure up a moment that can't be recreated, that and also can't really be captured on recordings and on film. As successful as we'll see the films were of the Monterey Festival and of Woodstock, the idea is that you're watching a document of something that can't actually be documented. And so you have this idea of, yeah, but I was there. And we still have that, right? We listen to a live album, especially one where we've been there, and then we're listening with someone else who wasn't there, and we're like, yeah, I was there. We have a certain cachet from being there. And we talk about the energy of that moment and of being immersed in that moment that can't be captured on tape, that can't be captured in a recording. And as extreme as it might seem, the auto-destructive aspect of this art is part of that, right? It's part of that moment. At the same time, people can't help but see it as a kind of open rebellion, and we can take that as being an empty rebellion or a beginning of something, right? Rebellion just for itself doesn't lead anywhere. It has to be focused. And so we might criticize The Who, and maybe even Hendrix, as having unfocused rage, right? But it's rage all the same. And certainly The Who capitalized upon that with songs like My Generation, right? With the stuttering being a kind of way of suggesting that I'm not understood. It might be a way of suggesting amphetamine use, since amphetamines can make you sort of stutter. They add to that kind of energy where you're trying to get out too many words at once. So my generation, right? There are all sorts of elements that we might tease out in this kind of music and in this kind of gesture. So we have the Monterey Pop Festival, right? This is them at the Monterey Pop Festival. They performed there in 1967. Their first UK top 10 hit was I Can't Explain from December of 64. And then My Generation in 65, which is a song I've already referred to. And then their performance at the Monterey Pop Festival. And there was some, competition between them and Hendrix for who would go on first, because they both knew that they were very involved in the auto-destructive aspect of art. And so they didn't want to be preempted in a sense, right? And they flip a coin to see who's going to go first. And of course, they both do destroy instruments in differing ways, as we'll see in that performance. The Monterey Pop Festival, they had played a few New York gigs before that, but this is really in some ways their introduction to the U.S. And it's a very successful introduction, as we'll see. But then we get to what many people consider the great albums, right? For my money, the most interesting is this one, The Who Sell Out, in 1967. It's a true concept album, right? And we want to think about this idea of the weak sense of the term concept album and the strong sense. And I think The Who Sell Out is a concept album in the strong sense. And we can make various arguments for this, right? Let's think about, for instance, Sgt. Pepper's. Is that a concept album in the strong sense or in the weak sense? Well, certainly it has a frame. That's one way of strengthening a concept, is by having a narrative frame. And Sgt. Pepper's does have that, right? And that narrative frame is the Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, which we have that song at the beginning, which introduces the whole show. And then we have it at the end. Actually, in a way, it's before the end, right? It's at the end of that frame, but then there's a song, Day in the Life, which occurs after the end of that frame. Now, you might say, as many people do say, that the songs in between, some of them support the theme of a kind of performance or event, like Mr. Kite's, the song about Mr. Kite, right? that has the carnivalesque atmosphere. But then she's leaving home. Does that really fit the theme? Even, a little help from my friends. Does it really fit the theme? No, a little help from my friends comes directly out of it, sequenced in such a way to come directly out of the song before it. And so it's clearly the beginning. It's led out of the beginning. It's led out of the frame in some fashion. So there are various ways in which they strengthen it. You might even say that the idea of it all being a performance from Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, by taking on an alternate identity for the band, that they are strengthening the notion of the concept album, right? Whereas, let's say something like In the Wee Hours of the Morning, an album that's sometimes thought of as the first concept album, goes back to the I guess early 50s, by Frank Sinatra, that is more of a concept album in the sense that all the songs have a similar orchestration. They all have a kind of moodiness to them. But is that a concept album in the strong sense? Is he telling a story? Is he providing a narrative or working with certain themes, right? Maybe not. Maybe it's a weaker sense of a concept album. Then you have albums, which we'll talk about in more detail later, of course. But you have albums like The Dark Side of the Moon, where all the songs are about insanity and capitalism and corruption and as forms of insanity. And so you can say that that's a theme-oriented concept album, and that might make it stronger in some sense, right? So it's not a narrative-minded concept album so much as a theme-oriented concept album. Then you have what I think of as the prototypical concept album. Prototypical meaning not first, but prototypical meaning kind of stands above the others as a true exemplar of its form, and that's Queensryche's Operation Mindcrime, where not only are there themes connecting the various songs, but there are motives and sounds that return throughout, right? Yes is another group that does stuff like that. But also with Operation Mindcrime, there's a single narrative. There's a narrative almost in a cinematic way that connects everything from beginning to end. It's all this one story that's being unfolded. And again, we'll talk about that album in greater detail later. The Who Sell Out is a very interesting and I think a relatively strong notion of the concept album. By strong and weak, this is not me passing critical judgment exactly, right? It's saying that they are, maybe I should use more or less prototypical if you prefer that, and that the Who Sell Out is on the more prototypical end. If Operation Mindcrime is on sort of the extreme prototypical end, the Who Sell Out is on the more prototypical end. It's kind of like The Dark Side of the Moon in the sense that it is a conceptual album based on a concept, on some ideas that are being explored. In this case, this concept album has all the songs tied together with fake commercial jingles and public service announcements, and some of the songs themselves are kind of parodies of advertisements. It features a single, I Can See for Miles, which doesn't fit the concept as well as some others, but some of the songs really do fit the concept. They're extended parodies of commercial advertisements. The most notable to my mind is Odorono, where a young woman thinks she's attracting the man of her dreams, but her deodorant lets her down, and she should have used Odorono. And you can see that there Pete Townsend is using Odorono, right? A giant bit of deodorant that he's putting on there in the upper left. And then you have Heinz Baked Beans, and to me, I'm pretty sure this has to be a parody of the Whipped Cream and Other Delights album cover by the Tijuana Brass, which we've already talked about. And here you can see Roger Daltrey immersed in a bathtub full of Heinz beans, right? And then you have the other two there also advertising various products. Medac for a kind of pimple or skin cream there. And then I can't remember what the ad is for the fourth one, but we can find out easily enough. At any rate, the point being that the entire album is tied together by a sound, by a set of gimmicks, the commercial jingles, and then by some of the gimmicks being so serious that they infiltrate the songs themselves, like Odorono, right? So you can understand why this album doesn't necessarily have a lot of hit singles, because there aren't that many songs that really stand alone. I Can See for Miles does. But, to my mind, I know people love that song. To my mind, it's one of the weaker aspects of the album because it doesn't fit as well the other parts of the concept. So I'm fascinated by this album, and I think it would be worth you listening to from beginning to end. I know you only have so much time, but I would suggest it. But then they go on to what many people consider one of the great concept albums, which is The Who, which is the Who's greatest concept album, Tommy, right? To many people's mind. It's their fourth album. They consider it a rock opera, right? And it more or less instantiates that form. There are plenty of rock operas that come about since then. It includes the hit Pinball Wizard, which with that interesting rhythmic guitar part, which sounds so straightforward and so recognizable and so easy, but it's actually quite difficult to perform adequately, properly. It was later made into a film with the director Ken Russell in 1975, and Ken Russell's a very interesting filmmaker. He made a film about Tchaikovsky. He creates these films. He does several horror films that are very lavish in their use of color and their use of imagery. They're usually kind of poorly acted, and it's not the best direction as far as the direction of actors and narrative structure goes, but for their visuals, they're amazing, right? So if you're into sort of B movies that are with interesting directors, then Ken Russell's your man. He has a film about Gesualdo, which is exhausting in some ways and fascinating in others. He's a pretty interesting guy. But Tommy, right, this is another strong example, or a prototypical example of a concept album where there are characters that are going to come out the back throughout the entire narrative. There is a narrative structure to the whole thing, and there's a kind of hero tale that's being told. And certain elements of songs will come back. So there's certain motivic, or at least textural and timbral returns to things to tie parts of the narrative together. If The Who is remembered for nothing else, then it would probably be remembered for this album, right? Which is in some ways better known than loved. It's one of those albums that people talk about a lot, even when they don't necessarily know it from beginning to end very well. Then there are two classic albums that they follow up with. 1971, of course, has Who's Next with Won't Get Fooled Again, one of their great singles, and Behind Blue Eyes, and Bob O'Reilly. Bob O'Reilly, to my mind, is one of the great overrated songs. I'm sure I'm hurting some people's feelings, but it is a very important song in its use of synthesizers, that texture that it creates out of all that sound. For me, it's a bit. It's sort of a epic that doesn't live up to its epic status, but we can talk about that more in our discussion sessions, and you can tell me why I'm so wrong, as plenty of people have done, and that's part of the joy of all this, right? Won't Get Fooled Again, I think, is a much stronger single. The way that it builds to the hook, I think, is really interesting. And Behind Blue Eyes, it's some people's favorite rock ballad in various ways. 1973 sees the release of Quadrophenia, which is sort of a self mythology. It's a second rock opera, and it celebrates their mod roots, including the song The Real Me, right? And this is another, I think, really interesting concept album. For me, it doesn't quite live up to The Who Sell Out, but it's a really interesting concept album to think about, and to for me, again, it's more interesting to think about than to listen to in comparison to The Who Sell Out, but there are some great moments in that album. Of course, one of the great guitarists, one of the legends, is Jimi Hendrix, right? Influenced so many people. It's easy for us to forget just how innovative Jimi Hendrix really was, because so many people in so many different styles have borrowed from the techniques that he developed, right? Think of John Frusciante in the Red Hot Chili Peppers. Just listen to Under the Bridge, right? And you can hear he's really copying that approach to playing that was developed by Jimi Hendrix. If you listen to some of the guitar tracks on releases by D'Angelo and the whole neo-soul sound, right, of the late 90s, early 2000s, you can hear that Jimi Hendrix approach to guitar is just taken as, well, this is part of the sound of that. But neo-soul and alternative rock are not intimately related. They're not totally divorced from each other, but they're fairly different genres. And then you can hear, even in guitarists who I think of as less directly inspired by Jimi Hendrix. You could still hear it, for instance, in Pearl Jam, right? All over the album 10, for instance. There's a lot of these Hendrixisms that show up, and even in guitarists who are amazing guitarists who don't necessarily pledge a direct allegiance to Hendrix. For instance, Jay Mascis of Dinosaur Jr., you can hear the way that he constructs his solos have an indebtedness to Jimi Hendrix. So we'll talk a little bit more about guitar technique in the next slide, but it's easy to forget, I think, just how important and influential Hendrix was. We take it because it's become such a kind of platitude. We just say, of course, he was incredibly influential. So what? He his use of feedback and so on, and then we think that's the end of it. But there was a lot more to it, and he didn't invent the use of feedback, right? But he does use it it drives things into a particular direction, and I think winds up being a lot more influential than we recognize because it was so influential. It was so successful in drilling down into our consciousness of just how rock goes and how rock guitar goes. He got to start playing with Little Richard and the Isley Brothers, and to some extent he probably learned some aspects of his emphasis on style from Little Richard, although, Little Richard says right from the beginning he had his own style, he had his own thing that he was bringing to the whole thing. In July of 1966, the Animals bassist, Chaz Chandler, saw Hendrix at Cafe Wha, the same place that Bob Dylan had frequented prior to that in Greenwich Village, and he brought him to London in September, and this becomes the Jimi Hendrix Experience, right? With Mitch Mitchell on drums and Noel Redding on the bass, and they released in 1967 their version of Hey Joe, and right from the beginning you can hear this guitar style of Hendrix's, which, like I said, we'll talk about more on the next slide. That was number 6 on the UK charts. And then you have Purple Haze, which was number 3 on the UK charts. They both demonstrate his early style, and really he only has an early style. He didn't live long enough to mature into a late style. He does develop. I'm not going to suggest that he doesn't, and we'll talk about that a bit, but it all happens obviously very quickly. We're now in 1967, and he only has a few years left, but he does a lot in those few years. I think of it as more exploring the things that he's setting forth in these 2 tracks, though. Because if you listen to Hey Joe, you have one aspect of his sound, and if you listen to Purple Haze, you have another. And he explores those 2 ranges and then a lot of things in between those 2 ranges in the course of the few years that remain to him. So let's talk a bit about that. Let's go to the next slide. He has a very innovative guitar technique, employing massive amounts of feedback, intriguing guitar voicings, and an idiosyncratic interlacing of harmonic playing and fills, right? He uses some surprising harmonies, like the sharp 9th chord, suspended chords, and parallel harmonies, some of which just become so familiar that they become kind of rock and funk rock cliches. So let's talk about this. I sort of set up a dichotomy, and I think it's worth exploring that dichotomy between Hey Joe and Purple Haze. Those are his 2 first successful hits, his first successful releases. So let's use those as our paradigm for exploring this. On Hey Joe, you have a song that he didn't write, right? And the way he's approaching the guitar is something that's similar to, for instance, Little Wing and Castles Made of Sand. Those are also great examples of this technique, where it's a relatively clean guitar sound. And what he's doing is he's playing the chord progression, but he's filling out the space of the chords. He's not simply strumming the chords, and he's also not simply playing a pattern or playing a kind of power chord arrangement of these things. What he's often doing is he's taking double stops within the chord. So think of the upper part of, say, the C chord, right? So you have the G, which is the 5th of the chord, and then the C above it. And then he's creating a hammer-on pattern and pull off so that you go from the G up to an A, back down to the G, while the C is still there. So that gives it a thicker sound, right? And then he's moving around within that chord, where the distinction between the fills and the chord itself it's not so easy to tease that out, that they stay part of one entity, right? And he's also using voices like these suspended chord voicings, where the third is replaced by the fourth, and maybe he resolves it and maybe he doesn't, right? But it gives it this more open sound. Now you connect all that together and you have a relatively busy sound where all the parts of the chord are represented, just not necessarily simultaneously, and they're represented in part by filling it in. So it's not exactly a solo. It is accompanimental, but it's not just strumming either. It's not just pure accompaniment. It has a kind of obligato line to it that works as a kind of counterpoint to whatever it is that he's singing or whatever it is the bass player is doing. So that's one side of the sound. This relatively busy accompaniment that involves counterpoint or pseudo-counterpoint, that involves a working out of the harmonies instead of just playing the harmonies, that involves suspended chords and so on, and sometimes parallelisms, right? Which you hear in things like Little Wing and so on, and the opening of Castles Made of Sand and things like that. That's the one sound. We'll call that for now the Hey Joe sound. Not because I think Hey Joe is necessarily the best example of it. In some ways, I think probably Castles Made of Sand is the best example of it, or maybe the opening of Little Wing. But I'm calling it the Hey Joe sound because that's the first release that typifies it. The other sound then would be the Purple Haze sound. That's more driven by the feedback. That's more driven by the sounds, the fuzz guitar, the overdrive, this big presence of the sound, riffs, right? So the riffs don't necessarily have to be super creative or super innovative, but there are these riffs that get stuck in your head. That song is interesting in a number of ways. It starts with the tritone and really it gets your attention to this dissonant sound right from the beginning. And yet at the same time, you don't expect that tritone to resolve. It's not like you're hearing it and you're like, oh, that's going to resolve. It creates a kind of stasis. So in other words, he's doing something that someone like Scriabin was doing in classical music at the beginnings of the 20th century, where that tritone becomes not a dissonance that has to be resolved, but rather a divider of the octave. Because after all, the tritone, the sharp fourth or flat fifth, right? So G sharp, or rather G flat or F sharp in relation to C, that evenly divides the octave. Right? Because if you count up from C to F sharp, that's 6 half steps, and if you count up from F sharp back up to C above it, that's another 6 half steps. So it's evenly dividing the 12-tone array of the octave, the 12-tone distance of the octave. And that's how he's treating it in that song. He's not treating it as though it needs to go somewhere. It's a kind of static element. You can keep doing that as long as you want. And then he moves into that riff, which fits very well on the guitar, right? It's amenable to the guitar as an instrument, but is also something you catch onto right away, right? When he starts singing, then you have that chord that I mentioned, the sharp 9 chord, and that becomes the basis, again, dissonant and yet static. You don't have to go anywhere. You're sort of immersed in the complexity of it. And that might be another element of the Dionysian, right? You're not simply staying within the realm of clarity. You're not just staying within the realm of just the triad. It's this dissonant sound, and yet you don't feel the need to progress somewhere. It doesn't have to go anywhere else. That the sound itself is kind of sufficient. Right? And that to me is the Purple Haze side of things, the feedback, the immersion in sound, right? Purple Haze is a lot more static in some ways than Hey Joe. Hey Joe depends upon the directedness of its chord progression, and all those fills help to exaggerate, if you will. Exaggerate's not even the word, bolster, because it's not exaggerated, it's just furthering, it's continuing the directionality of everything. Purple Haze, everything in it, even though there's a lot of tension in it, it doesn't feel like it needs to go anywhere. That tension, that dissonance is part of its stasis. And those are very innovative ways of dealing with harmony, very innovative ways of dealing with the possibilities of guitar tone, the clean tone, relatively clean tone in Hey Joe, the much fuzzier, dirtier tone in Purple Haze, right? And then you have everything in between, the various screams that he gets out of the guitar famously in his rendition of Star Spangled Banner, the way that you move from that clean tone of Little Wing to the solo and build that solo that also seems like it's directed and yet can keep going on forever, right? So navigating that space between the directed and the static. So then you have the release of Are You Experienced in 1967, which is a Pop 5 UK 2. It's second only to Sgt. Pepper on the UK charts. And it really is a kind of successor, and in some ways it furthers the things that are happening in Sgt. Pepper. It's certainly more psychedelic. It's involved in more psychedelic sounds than are managed by Sgt. Pepper, which is largely considered the introduction to psychedelia. I've already mentioned he becomes somewhat skeptical of what the Beach Boys do as barbershop psychedelia. He's looking for something else now, and he's also, I think, different from the kind of psychedelia that we saw with the Grateful Dead. Right, we're leading into the 70s here with a sort of rock psychedelia kind of way in which psychedelia becomes absorbed in a different aesthetic, rather than trying to create a space for contemplation or drug use or the expansion of consciousness. That's all being absorbed into something else, something a little more driven, something a little less static overall. Right, even if there are some songs that employ a kind of stasis like we just discussed. That's followed by two more classic albums by the Jimi Hendrix Experience. You have Axis Bold as Love, that's where Little Wing is in 1968. Those two albums, they have aspects of the conceptual without being necessarily concept albums, right? The first, Are You Experienced, and Axis. Electric Ladyland, I feel, is a little closer to a true or a strong or a prototypical concept album, where there's really a sound he's trying to work out. He's trying to sing a little more on that album. He becomes very self-conscious about his singing. He does not think of himself as a good singer. And so Electric Ladyland is his attempt to create a different kind of vocal timbre, a different kind of singing approach to singing. And you can hear that on various tracks. And that album is longer. It's a little more experimental in its approach to sound, its approach to creating longer songs, right? These longer journeys through songs. And that album will have a huge, if somewhat implicit, impact on progressive rock. It's not one that the progressive rock artists cite on a regular basis, but perhaps they should have, because that extension of the tracks, that way of approaching form, I think winds up having a bigger influence. Now remember, his first hit is in 67. By the end of 68, the Jimi Hendrix Experience as a band is done, and he's gone on to the band The Gypsies. He creates some, Machine Gun is a great tune, and you can hear that on a live album. He creates some important releases with the band The Gypsies, but he really hasn't fully moved into whatever he was going to do next. But by September 19th of 1970, he's dead of a overdose and choking on his own vomit. Who knows what could have happened in various ways. Like I said, he's still exploring, I think, in this period. He's still exploring his early period. If you listen carefully to the band The Gypsies, you might hear hints of where he might go, but we'll never know. It's impossible for us to know. Pink Floyd, another really important band within the experimentalism of psychedelia, right? They were formed in 1965, and they gained a following as an experimental psychedelic band with extended compositions, philosophical lyrics, and dazzling light shows. And those light shows are an incredibly important part of it. And as much as this is a music class, we can't ignore that aspect of it, that had a huge impact on how they were understood and how they became successful. They were a leading band for what became progressive rock, and they are, of course, cited by a lot of progressive rock artists, even though a lot of progressive rock artists think of them as a little too sloppy to be true models for what they were doing. So Emerson, Lake, and Palmer will refer to Pink Floyd in glowing terms, but they clearly consider Pink Floyd a little too sloppy for the kinds of things that they were trying to execute. Founded by Syd Barrett on guitars and vocals, and you'll see a picture of him in the next slide, and Nick Mason on drums, Roger Waters on bass and vocals, and Richard Wright on keyboards and vocals. They started playing long solos in their songs to stretch their sets, right? They were playing 3 90-minute sets a night at the Countdown Club, so they needed ways to stretch them. They only had so much material, but this became a defining aspect of their style. They became part of the underground music scene. They started playing at the Marquee, which was a very important place for them to play. We've talked about the Marquee before. And they began using projected slides for a rudimentary light show. And we've already seen the use of slides in the San Francisco aesthetic, and they began doing things like that. They're now known as a psychedelic act, and that's really where they were moving, with Barrett as their leader. They're playing fewer blues covers by that point, and Barrett really becomes their primary songwriter. And there he is. Syd Barrett is the second one in. So first you see Nick Mason, then there's Syd Barrett, sort of looking off into the. This is one of those pictures that you can easily read into in all sorts of ways, right? So you have Mason, who's kind of a 3/4 view. He's involved, of course, but he's never going to be the focus of the band. And then you have Barrett, who's kind of looking behind, and he's soon to be left behind by the rest of the band. But he's the visionary, and you can see some aspects of that, right? That he's just kind of lost in space, in the space of his own mind. Then you have, of course, Roger Waters next to him, also standing, looking into the future, and he will be the director in some ways of the band from here on out. And so he's also a visionary, but he's not lost in space. His gaze is very much directed to where they're going and what they're doing. Next to him, of course, is also standing is Wright, who's looking right ahead of you, along with David Gilmour, right? Both of them looking right at you. They're strong producers within this group. They're making material. They're very pragmatic in some ways. They're very focused, but they're not the visionaries that Barrett or Waters are. And those two are very different visionaries. Now, we can read this in other ways. Of course, many people do think of David Gilmour as a visionary, and he's certainly a hugely important guitarist for just the sound of the guitar, the melodic approach to soloing, and there's a lot to say about Gilmour. By not calling him a visionary, I'm not denigrating his position. I'm just saying that within the greater scheme of Pink Floyd as art, what we have are two visionaries with very different directions to their glances. That lost in space glance of Syd Barrett, and that I'm going to accomplish something big and people will recognize it and will see it for what it is of Waters. And of course, this picture is taken at a very pivotal moment, at least for those of us who think of early Pink Floyd as being defined in some ways by Barrett, because this is a picture taken at the point where he's almost out of the group. Before that, though, of course, they have Pipers at the Gates of Dawn, released in 1967. They had signed with EMI, just like the Beatles, and they released a single, not on this album, called Arnold Lane, which was number 20, despite the fact, in the UK it was number 20, despite the fact that it was subjected to a great deal of censorship, owing to the lyrics about a guy who is an open cross-dresser, right? In 1967, that was still something of a, especially within English society, something of a scandalous topic. And just the sound of that that song is worth listening to, as is the next one, See Emily Play, also released as a single, not part of the album. It reached number 6 in the UK. Barrett's starting to use LSD pretty heavily, and he's destabilizing mentally. There's tales of him putting it in a kind of waxy, having the LSD in this waxy substance that he would put in his hair, so that when he was under the hot lights during the performance, that waxy substance would melt, and the LSD would be absorbed in his skin, and he would become increasingly tripped out over the course of a performance. And he's starting to break down a bit. You can't do that much in that minute and expose yourself to that much stimulation without something occurring to you, right? Occurring for you, occurring to you and occurring with you. And so in August, they released their debut album, Piper at the Gates of Dawn. And this is number 6 on the album charts. And I would really recommend listening to this album carefully, right? Listen to some of the songs on the album, like Maximum Overdrive, for their experimentalism and the way that they're approached. And we'll talk about this in greater detail together. But the approach to structure, the approach to creating these, they're kind of doing some things that are similar to what the Grateful Dead are doing as well. This idea of exploring these spaces within songs and engaging in really closely listening to each other and deciding what to pick up and what to leave behind, what to reject. Right? And trying to create this kind of atmosphere that you're immersed in. Again, this kind of Dionysian space where you're immersed in an atmosphere that is chaotic, that is not perfectly controlled and rationalized. In December, in response partly to Barrett's increasing unreliability, the band added David Gilmour on guitar, and now Waters is becoming the leader of the group. I said Maximum Overdrive in that last slide, and I meant Interstellar Overdrive, obviously. But at any rate, we'll talk about that song more soon enough. The experiments continue, right? There's a Saucer Full of Secrets in 1968, and that's the last one that really, I would say, has any direct influence by Barrett. But Barrett becomes kind of the overseeing, what's the term I'm looking for here, a kind of patron saint in a way of the band, at least up through these albums, through and continuing with these albums. And then he continues to have a presence later, but he goes into a kind of self-imposed exile. He goes into a period where he's really not fit to connect to the larger world. He has a mental breakdown, shaves his head, lives in an attic of his family home for a while. He does still release some solo material, and I think it's worth thinking about and looking at. You have the opportunity to do that as part of your midterm, if you wish, and that would be one that I might encourage people to consider, because it's a great topic, some amazing music, but clearly music of a guy who's going deeper and deeper into himself, less and less concerned with the commercial, less and less concerned with how music typically goes. But he was in some ways already there, right? I mean, listen to the structure of See Emily Play, or even the way that the chorus works in Arnold Lane. It's not quite the and See Emily Play. They're not quite what you expect of your usual verse chorus structures, and we can talk about why I say that later. Then you get more and more bizarre experimental albums. There's Ummagoma, which is actually a number 5 UK hit in 1969, and then Atom Heart Mother in number 1 UK in 1970, and Metal number 3 UK in 1971. Listen to Ummagoma a bit, and especially that second side where there's more and more experimentation with tape and with tape compositions, right? So there are all these songs that are, and then there's experimentation with just creating kind of experimental classical music or quasi-classical music with some of the piano pieces that Roger Waters puts on that particular album. But of course, the album that is most responsible for their fame and for their reputation is The Dark Side of the Moon, released in March of 1973. Dark Side of the Moon was number 2 UK and number 1 US. It's clearly their magnum opus. Waters wrote all the lyrics. They concern, and this is how it's a concept album, and the more, I'd say it's toward the strong, if we think of it as a continuum between weak and strong concept albums, again, not meaning better and worse, but rather meaning more or less conceptual. This puts it toward the side of the more conceptual, in the sense that all the songs have these themes that go through them: insanity, conflict, greed, the passage of time, and death, which all relate back to the mental state that's being explored here. So insanity comes from conflict and greed, and the fact that we are going to die, which accounts for our experience of the passage of time. It's inspired in part by Barrett. These are Waters' reflections on Barrett in some ways. Each side is a continuous piece of music. This is another way in which it's a strong concept album. All the songs are sequenced together as a kind of suite, right? One leads into the other. Money is about corporate greed, and it was the most commercially successful track. It's their first album to use a 16-track mixer, and you can hear that in the density and the complexity of the arrangements. 1975 is Wish You Were Here, and that continues the investigation of greed and insanity, especially with the song Shine On You Crazy Diamond, which is a song in 9 parts broken into 2 sequences, which bookends or frames the album, right? So now, instead of a sort of minor, not terribly interesting song, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, it's not that it's a bad song, it's just it's not one of the most interesting on those albums, but its ephemerality is part of what makes it a frame. It's set up as the framework for the album. But here, the frame dominates the album, right? Shine On You Crazy Diamond is a major statement. It's like a multi-movement commercial song, or commercial's not even the right word, a multi-movement rock song. And it really is one of their most memorable. Then you have Welcome to the Machine, Have a Cigar. That's my brother's favorite. So there are plenty of things to talk about with that album as well. They have a string of successful albums after that, but to me, Wish You Were Here is their last major statement. There are plenty of things to enjoy on the later albums, but especially The Wall. And The Wall is a major statement. And we can talk about that more if you wish, culminating in the film and so on. Maybe I should have a slide for The Wall. I'll consider that. Anyway, for now at least, moving on. The Monterey International Pop Festival is in the spring of 1967, and it's organized by John Phillips of the Mamas and the Papas and the record company executive Lou Adler, and it's going to be held in June of 16 through the 18th of that year. It features Jefferson Airplane, Grateful Dead, Big Brother, and the Holding Company, with, of course, Janis Joplin singing. The Byrds, Mamas and the Papas, The Animals, right? They have a great set, actually, at the Monterey. The Who, Hendrix, and this is his U.S. debut. And it's not the Who's debut. Like I said, they had played some gigs in New York prior to that, but it's their first big show. Otis Redding, right? The R&B act, the headliner of Stax Records. The acts all performed for free. The only exception here is Ravi Shankar, who demanded $3,000 to play. And granted, he was playing for a long time, and it really is an amazing performance. Between 55,000 and 90,000 people attended. There's no secure records, so the estimation of how many people showed up differs, but it really serves as a model for other similar events, as we'll see, including Woodstock. Here we see 2 posters and a picture from the Monterey. That picture gets cropped a little too much. I'd like you to see the vastness of people there, but you can get a sense of it just from the density, right? The one poster you can see is a sort of just functional poster. It mentions Art Garfunkel, right? Simon and Garfunkel played there as well. The Association, Lou Rawls, the Beach Boys. There were a huge number of bands and acts, right? The other is more in line with poster art of the San Francisco style, and you can see the allusions here to perhaps a sort of Art Nouveau, or maybe even better, Gustav Klimt and the secession artists, right? The symbolist use of the repeated pattern behind her, the fact that the face is clearly a photograph, and the body may or may not be part of the same photograph, but then she's got this tie on that's clearly drawn on. So there's this interaction between the photographic and the drawn, this flattening of space between the person and her background, background, so that background comes into the foreground in a way that emphasizes design, ornament, repetition. Notice the symmetry of the way that she's holding her hands even, right? All that is accentuated here. And there are interesting things to think about with that here at the end of the 60s, it's almost like there's a return to the end of the 19th century and the secession movement, the beginnings of modernism in Europe, this idea of a kind of self-conscious modernism, a way in which we are part of the design of our world, a way in which our individuality is kind of flattened out to a certain extent, and therefore not denigrated, but we are made aesthetic. We are a kind of work of art in a relation to our world, not separate from the world, but in relation to it. And maybe some of that is what we're supposed to think about in looking at that bit of poster art. And certainly there's an element of that there's a kind of Dionysian quality, our sinking into the world, right? That, as I've said over and over again now, is a major part of how we are, I think, meant to understand these rock festivals, that we are sinking into our environment. We're losing a sense of our own ego boundaries, and those are being drawn away, and we're immersed in the world around us. We talked about that destruction of the boundaries of the ego with respect to psychedelia more broadly, and here we're seeing it applied to just these big festivals, because after all, I don't care how hard you try, you're not going to convince me that Simon and Garfunkel are a psychedelic band. I think the Animals barely fit that idea. So this idea of the psychedelia as being this kind of immersion, this Dionysic immersion into the group and into a larger sense of emotional or affective play, of losing the boundaries of the ego, of the self, that's starting to apply to the late 60s in general, not just psychedelic music. So this is an infusion of that energy of the psychedelic into the larger concern. And you can hear me talk a little bit about this in one of the podcast episodes on the Grateful Dead, which I would like you to listen to. Of course, this play of the Apollonian and the Dionysian. Here's another poster which draws our attention to some of the groups being played here. Notice that Janis Joplin and Grace Slick from Jefferson Airplane, Janis Joplin from Big Brother and Holding Company are put together here, and you can see them together as opposed to with their bandmates. There's a great picture of Otis Redding. That's clearly a promotional picture. So you're getting various kinds of pictures within the poster art for this performance. One way in which the Monterey Pop Festival was really mythologized after the fact was through this film by D.A. Pennebaker, which was just called the Monterey Pop Festival. But the film, D.A. Pennebaker, you might be familiar with him if you know anything about especially documentary film history. He was part of that movement of direct cinema, which was a often black and white, but not only black and white films, where they're trying to really immerse themselves in the subject of their documentary. So there's less narration, if any. Often there's no narration. You're just directly there with the subjects, right? One of the famous, or two of the famous films involve Kennedy. One is called Primary, which is about his the election process, and there's I think but maybe very little narration involved. It's not a documentarian telling you what you're seeing. You're just seeing it. You're involved in the moment. You're watching the events unfold. The other one that's also about JFK has to do with the desegregation of the schools, right? Which, granted, should have been done with 1954 Brown versus the Board of Education, but as we said, de facto discrimination takes a lot longer to end than de jure discrimination. So this is a piece of direct cinema as well. There's no narration. He's just showing you the various artists at work, and it becomes a very influential film, right? Because it kind of mythologizes the moment. it shows the kind of aesthetic of the rock festival, the immersion, and there are some famous moments, of course. As I mentioned before, the Who and Jimi Hendrix, they flip a coin to see who goes first, and the Who win, and they destroy their instruments on stage. Well, Jimi Hendrix can't be upstaged, of course, so he's got to come up with something bigger. So what he does is he lights his guitar on fire during his performance, his cover of the song Wild Thing, right? And he makes it into this kind of ritualistic element. And you can see that in the film. And he lights it on fire, and then he kind of begs it to become engulfed. And he thought the whole guitar would become engulfed, and it doesn't. So he kind of pulls at, in a way, the flames, almost like he's some kind of priest, high priest, performing a ritual, and when that's done, he then smashes it and throws the neck into the audience, right, as though he's giving the sacrifice over to the Dionysiac group. Well, all of this makes this film this legendary piece of cinematic, of direct cinema. And so people all over the country are seeing this film. That way they get to sort of vicariously attend the festival, or at least parts of the festival, the parts that were shown. And this winds up having a huge influence on the way that later festivals operate, right? Woodstock, of course, has the Michael Wadley film that's part of its development. The entire point of the Altamont Festival, as we'll see, had to do with it being filmed, a filmed performance by Rolling Stones. And we'll talk about that next time. So I will see you next time when we will continue this discussion of rock festivals and the films associated with them and the myths associated with them, and how all that kind of comes to a point of apotheosis, a kind of zenith, and then decline.